Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here today and delighted of the interest. You know, we have so many people interested in this topic. Grandparents often don't get the attention they deserve in the autism community, and especially in research, as we're going to talk about. Let me share my presentation. And hopefully this will come up for us. All right, so there's our first slide. Okay, so again, I'm Connie Anderson from Towson University. I already had a nice introduction. I just broke my ankle, so if you see me wiggling around, I'm trying to put my foot up somewhere. Apologize for that in advance. As Dominique was saying, I'm at Towson University in the Autism Certificate Program. I'm also formerly worked at Kennedy Krieger Institute in Baltimore as community scientific liaison for the Interactive Autism Network. And that's where we did this giant grandparent survey I'm going to be talking about today and filling you in on why we even decided to go down that path. I wanted to start out with definitions of family. When we hear the word family, there's often an image that pops into our heads, something like this silhouette on my screen. Kind of like those decals you see on the back of a car window where they have a little sticker, a little cartoon or stick figure or Star Wars figure or whatever cute thing they've done that kind of depicts a dad, mom, brother, a couple of sisters, dog and a cat. And that's kind of the first image we tend to have, parents and kids. But in reality, of course, families come in many shapes and sizes. My background is actually in sociology and marriage and family therapy originally. And as a sociologist, I can tell you families come in so many forms. Even couple households may be married or not married, straight or gay. Single parent households can be headed by never married parent or a divorced parent. We've got blended families with step siblings and half siblings and all kinds of complications. Some of them that are wonderful. One of my favorite people in the whole world is a step brother-in-law. Multi-generational families, of course, sometimes living under one roof. And grandparent-headed families are also out there in large numbers. When the Interactive Autism Network project launched way back in 2006, it was the first national online autism research project. It was kind of like an early Spark. It was before Spark and not as extensive, but it had a lot of people involved, over 10,000 by the time we were done. It was for families of a child on the autism spectrum. We were inviting mothers and fathers to join and share their experiences and tell us about their child. Our mission was to accelerate autism research across the board. And right after we launched, immediately after we launched, inviting all these moms and dads, we started getting phone calls from, can you guess? Here's a picture to help you guess. Here's a family with more than 2 generations in it. Here's another one, definitely more than 2 generations in it. And yes, of course, it was the grandparents that were unhappy, including my own mother, by the way. These grandparents were calling us and saying things like, I know my grandchild so well. I take care of him every day. Don't you want to know what I know? And of course we did. But unfortunately, the software we had at the time was locked. I mean, extensive development and design and preparations, magnificent software. It could contain information about a single person and then group them into family units, but it had only envisioned 2 generations, parents and children, and it was too late to do anything about that. I actually just learned that Spark has a 3-generation model, so I'm very excited that they are collecting and have already collected information on more than 300 3-generation families, but we didn't have that. So we had to look at those grandparents and say, we're sorry. you can't participate, which was not the answer anybody wanted. Well, inspiration struck. What if we did a survey and found the grandparents outside of the system that we had created at Ian? And we built that. We reached out to the Grandparents Autism Network, an organization that was founded out in California by Bonnie Gilman. We brainstormed questions with her and several other grandparents, pilot tested it with 40 grandparents who gave us a lot of feedback, asked if there's things we hadn't thought of that they brought up to us, until we came up with a final grandparents survey. It was launched in 2009 on October 5th. Autism Speaks and AARP spread the word for us, which we are very grateful for. And there was a huge response. I mean, we were absolutely delighted. Some had feared, and kind of told us, it's the internet. These are older people. You're not going to get people. They're not going to find this. They're not going to be comfortable answering it. But the truth is, even back then in 2009, according to the Pew Research Center, 75% of Americans 50 to 64 were on the internet already. That's now 96, so it's even better now. And 40% of Americans over age 65 were on. So there were a lot of seniors and pre-seniors on the internet already. And in addition to that being a positive for us, we decided to promise to share the results. Even though it was an anonymous survey, if they wanted to, grandparents could leave their email and we would share the results with them, which turned out to be, as the research had told us, it would be a big draw. They were very interested in learning what all the other grandparents had to say. More than 2,600 grandparents responded, which was a huge amount for a study like this. There's been very little research, as we'll discuss, on grandparents of children on the spectrum. And most research that's been done has maybe looked at 8 grandparents, 20 grandparents, 30 at the most. So this was a huge group to be able to hear from. We were fortunate they were from all over the United States, from cities or rural areas and suburban areas. They ranged from younger grandparents in their 40s to older grandparents in their 80s. And their grandchildren, although mostly were in the middle, from little kids to teens, ranged in age from 1 to 44 years old. 15% had 2 or more grandchildren on the spectrum, some who were siblings in a single family, some who were cousins. 3% had an adult child on the spectrum diagnosed, and 8% more suspected they had an adult child who could be diagnosed if they went and did that, which means 11% total. So one caution as we look at this group of people, it's a big group, it's wonderful, but we do have to worry about, especially at the time, the digital divide, which basically means the gap due to the socioeconomic status, education, location, that arises with involving access to computers, know-how about computers and broadband. And that may explain why this wasn't a very racially diverse, and even though we had some urban and rural folks, we had way more suburban folks. This might be different now. I hope it will be different the next time this kind of project takes place, because the internet usage is so high across everywhere, everywhere and everybody now. In terms of education, our grandparents were mostly reported having some college. And you can see here, 20% had high school, 18% had a bachelor's degree, and across the board. In their work status, we actually had retired not working, the top bar there, then 37% still working pre-retirement, 13% working post-retirement. So they were, they're very diverse, and you're going to see that theme throughout. These grandparents are different ages, different stages, and with their grandchildren similarly at different points in their journey, in their life. Ian and Spark have both had a hard time recruiting fathers compared to mothers. I think it was something like 8-1 at Ian. And the same thing happened with grandfathers. You know, we very much wanted the grandfathers too, but we had 83% grandmothers answering the survey, which I guess should not surprise us considering that's about what it looks like for moms versus dads. There was an interesting split between maternal and paternal grandparents. 2/3 of our participating grandparents were maternal grandparents. In other words, their adult daughter had the child on the spectrum, not their adult son. You know, is it just that more involved moms are sharing news of the survey with their moms? That could be part of it. And there is research that actually suggests it just is maternal grandmothers that provide more support in general to kids with disabilities of various kinds. So perhaps that's part of it too. For these grandparents, there were different dynamics and different roles. Some lived far away and saw their grandchild rarely. Some lived down the street or in the same household. Some have been officially or unofficially the primary caregiver of their grandchild. Some grandparents accept and understand the ASD diagnosis, and others reject it or are not comfortable with it. So people are in very different situations. One issue that's specific to grandparents. Grandparents share many things with the parents as far as some of their worries, but something that's specific for the grandparents is what I would call the double or maybe even the triple whammy. They're not just worried about their grandchild on the spectrum. They're worried about their adult child, who's the parent of that child. And often they're worried about unaffected siblings too, the other grandchildren, you know, and how it's affecting them and trying to compensate and spend time with them, those kinds of things. So there was a lot here. You can see in the blue and the purple is, you know, like 85% of these parents were worried about their adult child. Let's see, I need to uncover my screen so I can see here. So you're going to see some quotes in here. These are quotes straight from our grandparents. What we did with this survey is we didn't only ask multiple choice questions. We had some boxes where they could just pour out their hearts about everything. I think one of them was, what are your greatest challenges as a grandparent of a child on the spectrum? Another was, what are your greatest joys? We had several questions like that. And some parents wrote a book in there. They were so desperate and eager to tell their story. So these quotes are coming directly from these grandparents. In this case, grandma is saying, we try to help my daughter and son-in-law cope and make their lives bearable by giving them as much support and money as we can, you know, worrying about their adult children. There was also pride expressed in their adult children, as this grandmother said, all right, my daughter-in-law has become a very strong advocate and caregiver for her sons. I'm so proud of and awed by both my son and daughter-in-law for their strong commitment to their children. Another expressed joy at seeing how her son had become an incredibly responsible and nurturing father. Nearly 90% felt that the experience of, you know, going through the diagnosis and learning to address the needs of their grandchild on the spectrum had brought them together, closer to their adult child, the parent. One caveat with that, however, is we have to remember that the people who probably tended to take the survey were more involved, perhaps more content, more connected to their son or daughter, and definitely accepting of the diagnosis, right? Any of those questions are going to be a little bit skewed because those who rejected it or were very unhappy or depressed perhaps might not tend to participate. So you just have to keep that in mind. There were some conflicts with adult children for these grandparents. In general, grandparents always face a certain dilemma they learn to navigate, which is when to give their opinion to especially new parents, parents of babies and young children especially. That was even more pronounced for these grandparents of children on the spectrum. Here, a grandparent said, my son and his partner are dealing with my grandson's autism quite capably. As a result, my husband and I are challenged to remain on the sidelines and only give an opinion if asked. just as you can find a couple where the mother and father are really disagreeing and in conflict about the diagnosis, about a treatment choice, things like this, grandparents and adult children could also be in that position vis-a-vis each other. There were conflicts over whether this child needed to be evaluated or get a diagnostic workup. There were conflicts over the diagnosis that had been given and whether it was valid or not. There were conflicts over treatments. A parent might be very excited about some alternative treatment and the grandparent might be saying, I don't think that's valid. There might be a treatment that one of them thought was harmful and the other was advocating for. So definitely it wasn't always an easy path for parents and grandparents. An interesting piece that just really surprised us, so it probably shouldn't have, was that grandparents played a vital role in recognizing that there were issues with their grandchild. On the other hand, many hesitated to say anything. If you look here at this chart, you see 30% said I was the first to notice that there was an issue with my grandchild. That makes sense in a way if you think about it, because grandparents are experienced. There aren't that many families now where there's like 10 kids and the older kids have held the babies, and raised the little kids. A lot of young parents now, their baby's the first baby that they got to have any experience of, really. Whereas the grandparents have experience and maybe notice if something just isn't quite right, isn't the way it should be in terms of everything from eye contact to just interest and shared enjoyment and things like that. So 30% were first to notice, and an additional almost 50% were playing a supporting role. Maybe mom is saying, I'm getting worried, and grandparents saying, me too. The troublesome part was that it was hard for them to say anything if they noticed. I hear a grandparent said, I was the first to put a name to his condition. I knew earlier, but it was extremely difficult to tell your child that you believe her child has autism. Another said, I noticed signs when he was 2, but I didn't know how to voice my concerns without hurting his parents. We prayed for someone to notice, that they would believe. He entered preschool 2 half days a week in September, and they noticed by October, meaning the preschool folks. The preschool folks went and said something. But how, what a missing resource that we've got the grandparents who may know something and aren't able to share it. Saying something was challenging. It could lead to a clash. And of course, that was what they feared. One grandparent said, one grandmother said, back when I suspected it, my son got bitter with me and still is. Another said, from before the diagnosis, I knew what it was, but I had a very hard time communicating that something was wrong to my daughter, who didn't understand the subtlety of the symptoms and thought I was seeing ghosts. And, in early days, especially little tiny toddlers and things like that, when you're going through the diagnostic process, I think there's often different voices telling parents, I don't know, maybe you should have him checked out versus, boys are slow to develop, it's nothing. And they end up kind of pinched between those two positions and hoping, of course, that the people saying it's no big deal are right. But here, the grandparent was trying to say, let's get some help, and being outvoted. Many grandparents actually felt pretty supported, always or most of the time, and that included by their spouse if they had one, and by friends and relatives. May explain why many also reported they were coping pretty well. And in our publications on grandparents, we talk about this in terms of resilience, that they were pretty resilient, that at least this group that just chose to answer the survey with that caveat, once they had absorbed that their grandchild had autism, that they were coping well and actively helping. So here again, how well are you coping? The aqua and the orange are very well and fairly well. So luckily, only about 14% were having a tough time. The help grandparents could offer in terms of their contributions, kind of directly day to day, was somewhat dependent, of course, on how far away they lived from the grandchild's family. This was the spread here of how that broke down from living in the same house to living more than 500 miles away. You can see the peak there is 28% living 5 to 25 miles away, still close enough to get to you if they needed to. 7% reported combining households specifically to help manage everything that was going on with the autism spectrum diagnosis. 14% had moved closer, but not into the same house. So that's actually more than 20%, like about 21% made a big change in their living situation to be there, for the family. Non-custodial grandparents who were close provided a lot of caregiving and transportation for their grandchild with ASD. We did have some custodial grandparents we'll talk about, meaning they took over primary caregiving, but most of our grandparents, about 1,800, were non-custodial. You see here, 56% provided at least some caregiving each week when they lived 24 miles or closer from their grandchild, 29% providing some transportation in that situation, and that dropped off a lot once people were further away, which you would expect. Grandparents did make many sacrifices trying to assist their adult child's family, including financial ones. Many helped with clothing or food, housing and health insurance, special camps or summer programs, therapy or counseling, legal and advocacy costs, all kinds of things related to the child's ASD. It's a quote from a grandmother that she goes, "As I am in my senior years, sometimes finding the strength and or the energy to just keep up with our grandson is hard. It's difficult to take him out to public places, which keeps my husband and me home." Just as our daughter, the mother of the child, is divorced from the father and she needs to work. So they live with us full time. So for this family, one of the sacrifices is just becoming more tied to their home, becoming primary caregivers often, and becoming a bit more isolated. Financially speaking, this family talks about paying for services that aren't covered by health insurance. We've spent our retirement, says this grandfather, and we do it again to benefit our granddaughter. We have her with us 3 to 4 days a week. This was a shock to our family. Her parents were in their early 20s, and they weren't prepared for a child with special needs. And again, you think about it, you've got families where the parents are 20 something, and the grandparents are 40 something or 50 something, and families where the new parents are 39 and the grandparents are significantly older. So really different pictures for these different types of families. These are some of the sacrifices some of the grandparents reported. And remember, it's probably more of them made by those who live closer, right? 21% went without something they'd hoped for, whether it was to be able to travel, to maybe to redo the kitchen. I heard all kinds of things. They left us all kinds of notes about the things they'd hoped to do and just decided, well, that's not happening. They became the main babysitter. In many cases, some raided their retirement funds. Some continued working when they'd hoped to retire. Others borrowed money or returned to work when, they clearly that wasn't the plan. Like parents, if they were deeply involved, they ended up trying to juggle work, saving, spending, and caregiving. This is a long quote, but it kind of gives you the picture. She says, "My daughter works full time and then works every Saturday and Sunday all day and one night in a store to pay for all the extra expenses. I try to contribute financially to take off some of the pressure they experience every day, trying to pay the bills and keep things going, right? Like getting kids to school and things like that. I work also and have some flexibility so I can help them out when kids are sick and out of school, but I pay the price because I should be making more money and putting it away for retirement." So some of those, you think of these as hidden costs, that are going on due to an autism diagnosis. It's just the money that wasn't saved, by parents and grandparents for future needs. And actually those future needs are a big deal when you think about a child on the spectrum that you're hoping to have a special needs trust for at some point, or pay for a college education, all of those things. About 6% of our grandparents said a family situation had become so untenable or fraught that they had taken on the role of parent. Interestingly, only 1% were legally, officially a foster or adoptive parent or taken on some kind of guardianship. The other 5% said we're primary caregivers in fact. It's not official or legal. And as we delved into that, we found that was a huge struggle for those folks because they were running into barriers all over the place when they were trying to get treatment and healthcare and things like that. They really needed support to deal with the legal aspects of that. Said one grandmother, the child's parents have their own mental health issues, and they really don't parent this child the way he deserves. Another said, I have too little control over their parents and their failure to deal with my grandchild by obtaining the help he needs and modifying their lifestyle to accommodate him. That was including controlling household noise and just trying to communicate with him. So not all the parents were ready for this challenge, and sometimes grandparents just took over. Grandparents who had taken on that parent role faced the full brunt of the financial burdens associated with ASD. Here we have a grandparent says we have spent over $300,000 over the last 4 years with ABA therapies and other expenses, trying to get the best treatments for our grandson, now 6 years old. My husband has to go back to work now. We've exhausted our savings in retirement. What are we going to do when we run out of money? Our friends do not understand the challenges we face every day. A comment on that, these families that can spend $300,000 on ABA, there were many, many grandparents who didn't make financial contributions, and that was mostly because they couldn't. There was a lot of guilt about not having funds because they just weren't in a position to be spending that kind of money. You know, we're helping in every way they could, but not everybody could make those huge financial sacrifices. They might not have retirement to raid, for example. Far away grandparents sometimes experienced guilt that they couldn't do more on a day-to-day basis. But the more grandparents were there, present and involved in raising their grandchild, the more their experiences paralleled some of what parents report. You know, they also were going through a whole journey of accepting and understanding the autism diagnosis and their grandchild's own kind of unique way of being. You know, learning to appreciate and celebrate that. They were worrying about finding effective treatments, not only finding them, but then getting access to them and paying for them and getting to them. They were sometimes isolated and lonely, felt like others didn't understand the situation they were going through. That might be even a bit sharper for grandparents, you know, who aren't thought of first when you're thinking of support groups for people on this, you know, for parents of kids on the spectrum. The grandparents aren't always included in that vision. They also suffered through the critical looks of strangers, you know, who were judging them. You know, every time a child had a meltdown in public, they sharply felt those critical looks, as parents often report that they feel. Though many were coping, as we saw, there were challenges, and some reached out to clergy, therapists, and support groups for assistance. One grandmother said it was very hard watching her gentle grandson suffer from the effects of autism. She said, he cannot sleep through the night. He struggles to verbally communicate. My daughter is suffering from depression. Doctors are ignorant about what can be done for the children. Insurance doesn't cover therapies such as speech and physical therapy, occupational therapy. There's so much financial strain on families. So, you know, there were people who were having trouble sleeping at night over all these issues. Here are grandparents talking about how they feel like they can't pour out their own angst about all this because they're worried. They know their adult child's got their own worries, and they don't really have a place to pour this out. She says, one challenge is keeping my sadness to myself so I don't further upset my children, not giving advice or information when I know my children are stressed enough. I have problems relating to my autistic grandson. I feel sad and frightened by his autism, and I'm afraid he'll go out of control and I won't know what to do. There's also lots of guilt since I live 2 hours away. So much is packed in there, her isolation, no one to share her worries with, um, not being sure how to relate to her grandson, especially those who lived a bit further away and don't get that experience where you just figure it out. Um, and especially if a child was having meltdowns and aggression or something. She's like, what if we're left here and I don't know how to handle it? Communication was one key issue. Our grandparents wished for better communication. Now here a grandparent is rejoicing in her grandchild, but also just wishes they could talk to each other. Because communicating with my grandchild remains my greatest challenge. I love him with all my heart. He's a sweet, good-natured 6-year-old, and we often sing to communicate. However, I would love to actually have a conversation with him. When it came to the children who might be physically regressive or resistant to sleep or prone to elopement or wandering beyond safe spaces, it could be especially hard on the grandparents. And that goes double as kids are getting older, bigger, heavier, and grandparents are getting older. So that was a specific real worry and struggle for these people. Here, a grandmother says, my grandson is 9, severely challenged by autism. We're the main providers of respite for him. And as he's gotten older, the care has become more difficult. The biggest issue is concerning the carer. He's not potty trained. He's nonverbal and very physical. When he's upset, he'll have meltdowns where he'll bite, scratch, and pinch. Perhaps the biggest challenge is the continual need to keep him safe. He has no sense of danger at all and requires constant watching. And you can imagine if, you're 68 or whatever, and by the time this 9-year-old is 14 years old, this is going to be really increasingly difficult and maybe even impossible to provide care, which they're worried about. Many regretted, and I think this is similar to parents, that what should have been fun and easy activities with their grandchild could be overshadowed with anxiety over a potential scene. Grandmother said everything becomes a project instead of a fun outing. Simple things are often just too much to tackle, not worth the effort and drama. And as she says that, I'm imagining a trip to Target, right? Eating out in a restaurant, going to Disneyland, right? All of those kinds of things that parents also say, if it becomes just too hard, that's when families start to isolate. And the grandparents were prone to the same withdrawing, from some of these activities, because if it was potentially going to go downhill and be really tough, the families would tend to withdraw a bit, which is not good for the grandparents either. As is often the case with an invisible disability, meaning one that isn't obvious just by looking at someone, one burden the grandparents felt they had was educating other people, making them understand what autism is and what's going on with their grandchild. Some became fierce advocates. Nearly 50% had participated in autism blocks or fundraisers. 33% had been involved in political advocacy around autism. 31% had attended conferences and workshops on autism. So these were pretty active grandparents trying to become more and more knowledgeable and better advocates. There were many joys. So yes, there's challenges. We know what the challenges are. But there were also so much joy in these grandchildren. These grandparents told us about reams and reams. Probably hundreds of pages that they wrote. They found their grandchild with ASD often to be loving and caring. They felt intense connections with their grandchildren. They celebrated their uniqueness and their success. They came to appreciate their own little way of being with whatever quirks they had. Says one grandmother, my grandson's the sweetest, kindest soul I know. He feels safe with me because I try to embrace the wonderful qualities he has. I love him so much. I wish I could get him all the help he needs. He's 11 years old and in junior high. He's picked on for his differences. I don't know what to do except to tell him he's awesome and that I'm always here for him. So you can imagine that these grandparents become just an absolutely central, essential, amazing figure in this child's life. You know, one of the few. The relationship that I have with my grandson, says another grandparent, is one of my greatest joys. We have a special relationship. My heart nearly burst when he began saying my grandparent name, Baba. Another said, my greatest joys have been the success of this little guy growing from nonverbal and non-ambulatory 18-month-old who was totally uninterested in another human being to a 4-year-old who talks constantly, sings, laughs, and expresses love. He runs and jumps and actively seeks approval with hugs and kisses. And this was a theme too, watching the kids succeed and make progress with their therapies and just grow was a delight for these grandparents that they would celebrate. Some of the takeaways are that grandparents often play a major role in identifying ASD, researching treatments for ASD in their family, caregiving, transportation to therapies and school and every place else, and all around support. At the same time, they're worrying about their adult child, the grandchild on the spectrum, and the unaffected grandchildren too. Clinicians, researchers, therapists, and educators should keep in mind that a grandparent may be an influential figure in the family, including around making decisions about evaluation and diagnosis, may have critical insights about their grandchild with ASD, including their history, their behaviors, their strengths, maybe tips on what works for them, like if they're starting to get upset, how you de-escalate them. They may know that very, very well and be a great source of information that people don't think to ask. They may be involved in advocacy with school, clinical settings, and more broadly. And lastly, they may need support themselves. They likely do need some support themselves because this is a huge impact on their lives. There's still so little known. I was actually shocked when I was going to give this webinar. I was, of course, looking at, okay, well, what have people done since our survey and since our publications? In the last decade, only 15 articles were published on grandparents of children with physical, intellectual, and neurodevelopmental disabilities, according to a recent review. Only 6 were focused on autism, and 2 of those were based on our survey, which we did. So that means there's a lot more room to investigate what's going on in the lives of these grandparents, and also a room for a big update. One group is actually hoping to recreate the grandparents of children with ASD survey. We gave them our questions that we used at the time. It's the Autism Grandparents Club in association with the Virginia Commonwealth University. They ran a new grandparent survey in this fall. Of course, we don't have results yet, at least I haven't seen that yet, but I can't wait to see what they discover. And I'm realizing there's a lot more room to delve into this topic some more because very little's been done. And I guess it's time for questions.
Wonderful. Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Anderson. We do have some questions. And as a reminder, if anyone else has questions they'd like to see Dr. Anderson answer, please submit them in the Q&A box if you're joining us on Zoom, or if you're on Facebook, you can submit them as a comment and we'll pass them along. So to get things started, our first question here is, how should a grandparent who has concerns about their grandchild talk to the parents?
You know, the best way I kind of borrow from the educators I know who have to broach something with parents, but don't want to actually diagnose or say anything. And often what they say is, you know, I'm a little concerned about that. What if we just get him checked out to rule out any issues? You know, so if you have a parent that's prickly, who's going to respond badly if you're actually saying autism, I would suggest just saying, you know, I'm concerned about behavior X. You know, maybe we should just get him checked out to rule out some things and see if we can get some assistance. It's different if the parent's bringing up their worries, then you can jump in and say, you know, I have that worry too. Right. But I think it's the grandparents that are worried that they're going to be pushing their adult child away. Their adult child's going to say, you know, don't say that to me, that's ridiculous, or something like that. You might avoid the A word and take a more general approach.
Great. And then actually a question that just came in that kind of piggybacks on this one is, are there any support groups for grandparents of children with autism spectrum disorder? Or maybe they could find out some more tips.
Right. Well, there's definitely the Grandparents Autism Network, even though it's run out of California. I believe she's got, you know, groups formed all over. But anyway, you can look up those guys because they have a website and that. And then this other one I just said on my slide, that's a new one to me, this Club for Grandparents. They've started a website. But I would also, I would encourage grandparents to maybe go through some of the existing organizations. So the Autism Society of America often has support groups, and it would be possible to say, can I come to the support group you already have as a grandparent? And if you wanted to form one for grandparents, you might be able to do it through like those existing organizations as well. So there's kind of a different avenues. I would check out the Grandparent Autism Network, and then also your more local organizations that are already in process.
Great. And switching gears, how much do you think that these findings from the survey are specific to those with a grandchild with ASD versus having a grandchild with any special needs diagnosis?
Some of it is specific. I think perhaps caregiving and financial pieces might be similar to kids with another, maybe intellectual disability, maybe Down syndrome or something like that. But some of this is very autism specific. You know, the panoply of co-occurring conditions, the multiple treatments that people are trying to cope with, the behavioral piece that is so tough, especially during the younger years. Often, I mean, there are teenagers that also have explosive behaviors, but a lot of times people are kind of getting through some of that during those early childhood years. I think a lot of that is more specific to autism than it is to, you know, just intellectual disability, Down syndrome, some of the other issues, even ADHD and things like that. There's just extra layers of difficulties, including things like elopement, you know, meltdowns and aggression, which are the real tough ones for families.
Great. And then on that note, somebody asked, how can I tell if my 4-year-old grandson is having a meltdown or is merely acting out as a normal 4-year-old?
You know, that's a difficult question. You know, I feel like a meltdown is more like their whole brain has widened out, right? They're unable to be communicated with. There's something a little bit manipulative in a tantrum. You know, someone's actually trying to get something out of it. But meltdowns are like they absolutely cannot cope with whatever's happened. Like, let's say the routine has changed. Like, I know my son used to have meltdowns where if we drove a different path to school, he'd suddenly be absolutely beside himself, like the world was ending. Meltdowns are more like that. It's like the brain has fritzed out. There's no communicating with them. There's nothing manipulative about it. You can't talk to them. They're going to have to come down from it before you can even discuss it. It feels more completely involuntary, you know, than a tantrum. You know, it is hard. I know it's hard to sometimes tell, but you get to the point where you can kind of tell the difference between just you know, I want an ice cream, you know, I want a pony, kind of a meltdown. And that's a problem, right? Because you'll often find parents in conflict where the mom's seeing it as a meltdown and the dad's saying, you just spoil him. So he's acting this way, as if it's a tantrum, if we're going to distinguish between those two things. But a meltdown is definitely more like their brain has widened out because of their rigidity, things like that. If it's something like they've lined up their trains and someone knocked one out of place and it's like, to me, that's a meltdown. Does that help? I hope it helps a little bit. It is hard to learn to distinguish those things.
No, I think that was a great response. And hopefully that helped whoever asked that question. Our next question here is, what do you see as the potential role of grandparents on supporting their autistic grandchild as they age?
I think if they've been there all along, they're a key figure. They're just such an important person. There's such a bond, as the few families that I know personally in the situation, there's such a bond, especially because there are times in the life of a person on the spectrum. There may be some unhappy years. There may be some times where they're not getting invited to birthday parties or there aren't a lot of friends, where their grandparent is just one of the lights in their life. Going to Walmart to buy a Lego with their grandparent is like one of those wonderful things in the world. And that relationship endures, I think, as time goes on. And is even reciprocated. I know my son once said to my mom when he was like 20 something, he said, when I get my license, which he was working on, when I get my license and you can't drive anymore, I'm going to drive you everywhere like you drove me. So it's just a really central, important relationship and overlooked so much.
And, in a similar vein, talking about the grandparent role and the parent's role, how would you recommend a parent approaches a grandparent who's involved in, working and helping with their child, but may not be doing so in a way that's in line with what parents or providers are encouraging as a way to interact with the child?
So I'm assuming you're kind of talking about like you kind of have a plan, like maybe there's a routine that you're trying to establish and the grandparent's not quite going with the routine, or some kind of intervention you're trying to do and they're not quite following through with the instructions or whatever it might be. That's hard. That's hard in couples too, right? There might be dad might be doing it, mom's not doing it, or vice versa. I think it boils down to really explaining why you're doing it, I don't think it's just demanding that you follow a certain bedtime routine or something, but why it's important that you're finding that it makes that to maybe have this visual schedule at bedtime and to follow this schedule at bedtime is so important. It's helping the child learn to get to sleep better and sleep through the night better and the whole family sleeping better. So please follow this when he's at your house, right? This kind of a thing. I do think explaining what's behind it is really important. I was just talking to a psychiatrist yesterday and we were talking about what do you do when the families are resisting you or not understanding what you're trying to ask to be done. And it was the same kind of advice, to really go into depth of why am I doing this? Why am I asking you to do this? And hope that, they're going to understand your position on that. Having said that, I would say there is something to be said for a place where the rules can be a little looser. And again, you've got to decide where you are with a kid's development and how they're doing. Maybe they need a place where the rules are off a little bit, but it's not when you're in the middle of trying to establish a new routine, a new bedtime routine. And so it's like, now we'll get it established and then we can loosen up later, maybe, that makes sense. I hate to say everybody has to always follow the exact rules, but it's again, the vast differences across everybody makes it hard to give advice that's one size fits all.
Absolutely. Yeah. And are there any effective de-escalation techniques, perhaps from something like a meltdown, specifically to help grandparents manage a situation and keep themselves and their grandchild on the spectrum safe?
When it comes to meltdowns, rule number one is prevent it, right? So just as with an older child, you're teaching them to notice the signs that they're getting upset, and then helping them have some kind of skills to use, like deep breathing or self-talk. It's okay, it's not the end of the world, I'm okay, count to 10. It's the things you teach an older child so they can self-regulate. As a grandparent of a child, you're also saying, what are the signs? When do I know they're proceeding towards a blow up? And how can we stop that before it happens? That's always preferable to after it happens. If you see the signs, you're going to try and distract. It's like, oh, let's watch your favorite video right now. I mean, whatever you can do to stop the buildup. If it's happened already and there's nothing you can do, the advice I read in a book long ago about meltdowns and autism is walk, don't talk. You can't talk at them once they're in a meltdown. As I said, they're in that brain is whited out. They're just in a complete kind of a fritz of their brain. So you try to just stop everything, not talk at them. I used to maybe even put my son in his room and let him calm. If they like deep pressure, you could have them, this is where it comes knowing the child, do they like to be like wrapped in a blanket? Do they have a weighted blanket? Is that something that helps them? Is jumping on the trampoline help them? What will help them to calm down? And that's kind of an individualized thing, but you can't start correcting them. It's like, forget it. They can't process it. It'll only make it worse if you start to say, well, you should have done this, you're out of control. Whatever. That doesn't help. It's just like, okay, we're all going to get quiet now. And the hardest thing of all in a meltdown is to stay calm yourself. And it's hard. It's really hard because of course you're activated by all this, screaming and whatever's going on. Then it's like, you have to breathe. You have to bring yourself down so that the whole room is going down. And then hopefully turn on their favorite thing or bring out their favorite. If their favorite thing is to look at their Pokemon cards, bring out the Pokemon cards, and after they're calm, maybe you can talk about all this. But, once it's happened, you're just trying to go for de-escalation.
Right. We have a couple minutes left here, so maybe one or two more questions. In your presentation, you spoke a little bit, or you showed a graphic that showed, the distance in which grandparents lived from the home of their grandchild. So, for instance, for a grandparent who might live a little further away and is perhaps visiting, how would you, what's the best way to involve that grandparent in that child's day-to-day without maybe causing too much conflict in their routines or therapies?
I think the main thing is to maybe simply communicate. You don't want to overwhelm people with information, but if you could let the grandparent know ahead of time, if there's some things that are the key items, like we need to follow our routine, or maybe food's an issue, you could say our son is on the autism spectrum and he has some really limited food choices. Please don't comment on that because it can lead to difficulties, or please don't try to introduce some other food in the middle of this visit. Don't cook your favorite lasagna and think my kid that only eats chicken nuggets is going to eat that. It's like you have to think ahead to what might they do. I mean, you can't predict everything, but think ahead to what might they do and see if you can fend off some of the things that might result in everyone being unhappy. Because of course you want this encounter to be a good one, right? For both the grandparent and the grandchild. You might suggest to them, when you come, he loves this, bring him a little Lego and let him show you his Legos, or, whatever, they've all got favorite things, to suggest connecting through whatever their special interest is, whether it's Spider-Man or, My Little Pony or whatever it is, to kind of go with that. And it's almost like, if you're familiar with floor time, the follow the child's lead, kind of get involved with what the child's doing, do it with him and stick with that, is always a good advice. And to have the parent just check in with the parent, would he enjoy making cookies with me? What part of that could he do? Could he measure things, or could he just pour them in the bowl? Just work out some of that ahead of time.
Wonderful. Yeah, so it sounds like a lot of the communication between the parent and the grandparent is key there. Well, thank you again so much, Dr. Anderson, for today's webinar. It's all the time that we have today, and your presentation was amazing. And we want to also thank everyone who's joining us.
Oh, my pleasure.